Hi, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and then we can get started talking about plant interactions and limitations to growth. So I started class by having a conversation about this image that basically created these pockets of seed dispersal, right? So areas that were cleared, and then we're looking at how time species are regenerating in these areas and how their connectedness influences seed rain. And so that's really the subject of our conversation today, is trying to figure out how plants grow together, right? So how do we find different species of plants growing in the same area or over time since disturbance? And so the competitive exclusion principle was an early theory talked by Elton in 1927, who basically said that two species competing for the same resource can't exist. But the problem with that, of course, is that plants do coexist. We have many, many species, hundreds of species in the tropics that grow in the same meter of rainforest. And so either that hypothesis is wrong or something else is happening, right? And so what we think is happening is resource partitioning, meaning that different species have different niche requirements, right? And that then allows them to grow together in the same location because they acquire different sets of nutrients. And so when we talk about the term niche, this is kind of one of these fundamental terms that people use in ecology. Everybody who's an ecologist sort of knows this term and can manage it, but it's really this role of an organism with its environment, right? So what function does it have, right, in the environment? What types of physical conditions are needed for the species survival, growth, reproduction? But really, it's a set of both, right? It's this set of attributes held by the species, and then the relationships between that species and its environment, right? So in ecology, we're really talking about these interactions, and so that's very true when we talk about niche theory in the context of forests. And so this interaction, lots and lots of examples of this, right? The death of a dominant tree creates the gap. It's both an opening and an opening up of growing space, right? Resource availability. And so the seedling succession is going to be a function, right, of competition, pathogens, microclimate, soil nutrients, etc., right? And so each of these is a filter, right? So the species that can pass through these filters are the ones that are going to bring its own effects on the environment, right? So they can have these ecological effects by changing their own microclimate, and then of course chance. What happens if the most competitive species doesn't actually make it to the site because the closest seed source or propagule source is very, very far away or non-existent. And so we're going to sort of shift now this semester to start talking about like why plants grow where they do, right? So there's this three-part mantra, tree growth. And it really has to do with describing where plants successfully compete, right? So all trees grow better on good sites. Good sites are things like nutrient rich, lots of water, right? But some species grow so well on good sites that they outcompete all other species. And so really species are found where they can compete successfully, not where they grow best. And so this really gets into that idea that I talked about a couple of weeks ago, where I talked about Marxist trees or Marxist forests. Competition is really at the root of what controls what types of species and which species and where you find them on the landscape over the course of time. And so, again, why do plants grow where they do? So here's an example of this idea of competition, right? So tulip poplar and Virginia pine, they both do better or grow higher or taller on better soils, right? Moist, well-drained soils versus droughty soils. But when you grow them together, tulip poplar is most competitive on the moist, well-drained soils, and Virginia pine is most competitive on the droughty, drier soils. And so what happens is in certain parts of the gradient from xeric to hydric, or very dry to moist to wet, certain species have a very that require very mesic soils. Others can be competitive across xeric or hydric soils. And so what you see is that the most competitive species forms a stand, right? But then disturbances sort of reset that, right? So, and so what we see though is that on these figures across a gradient from xeric to hydric, there are certain species that are more site sensitive. So lodgepole pine in this image, what you see is that it has a really wide site amplitude or ecological amplitude, right? Because it can grow across a very wide range of conditions, whereas red alder is site specific. And so it is more site sensitive, can only grow under a narrow range of environmental conditions, but it's very competitive within those environmental conditions of sort of fairly wet or moist, right? Favorable conditions. But we get lodgepole pine, which is a Western species that we see a lot in the Rockies. Lots of pines do very well in very harsh sites. So what we see is lodgepole pine can grow there, and it can also grow in very wet sites. On the other hand, something like Virginia pine over here on the left has can't grow on that hydric end of the spectrum. And so it actually has less ecological amplitude, right? So it's not quite as wide, right? It's more site sensitive than lodgepole pine that could grow across the entire soil moisture gradient. And so when we talk about niche theory and competition, we can also talk about this idea of fundamental niche versus a realized niche. So the fundamental niche is like the set of all the sorts of different kinds of environmental settings and conditions where you could find a species. Whereas the realized niche is where the species is actually found. And so the fundamental niche is something that's fixed, but the realized niche is really flexible because it depends on other species, right? And it actually depends on competition, right? Among different species and or resource partitioning, right? Different species using different resources. And so we just sort of talked about how this fits with the reading, which of course was complicated, but essentially the idea was that the competition is driving the patterns of recovery in forest stand development, right? And that species may, in fact, have different sorts of sets of traits that allow them to survive in different kinds of conditions within the same forest. And so what you can see here on the right is just mimicking what we see on the left. Call this an n-dimensional hypervolume. That's what G. Evelyn Hutchinson, who invented the term niche, called the niche, an n-dimensional hypervolume construct. But essentially, we know that a species niche is a multidimensional set of requirements that help a species survive, grow, and reproduce, right? And so what we see is that species A on this gradient likes low nutrient, dry, low nutrient, dry, high light conditions, whereas species B likes high nutrient, wet, high light conditions. And so what you can see is that these species are able to coexist because they use slightly different sets of resources within the system. And so these traits vary among species, and then also even within species. So things like height growth rate, leaf thickness, leaf mass, epicuticular wax content. That's just the wax that's on the surface of a leaf to help leaves not dry out and also stave off some of the effects of high solar radiation that can be damaging to a leaf. And other things like photosynthetic rate. Obviously, an understory shade tree species is going to have a different photosynthetic rate than a canopy tree species would be lower. And so just wanted to bring everyone's memory back into what the formula for photosynthesis is. And of course, we take carbon dioxide and water with light energy, and it creates food for plants and oxygen for us to breathe, right? And so the stomates, which are located in the leaf, and there some species have them on both sides, others have them just on the underside, that you see in the right-hand picture here are closed right now, but they regulate gas exchange. They do it very, very quickly. And so they do that to open up in the morning. They'll be open and they'll photosynthesize till about midday or late afternoon if the conditions are favorable enough. But then when it gets hot and dry, plants will start to shut down and they'll close their stomates. Within a matter of seconds, they can do this. It's almost instantaneous. And then they kind of go into holding pattern to reduce damage from high sunlight in their tissues from photooxidation, and also to reduce excessive drying of the leaf. And so then about sunset, they open up their stomates again and they recharge their water resources, and the whole cycle starts again, right? And so I wanted to take a moment sort of to think about then like how we might differentiate species, right? So there's this biological species concept, right, where species that don't hybridize, right, species that interbreed are distinct in terms of their reproductive isolation, meaning that a species can't reproduce with another species, right? No hybridization. And then there's this morphological species concept, right, where we group species by physical traits, right? And so we're going to be talking about this morphological species context in the context of our reading from today. And I just wanted to get everybody on the same page when we talk about these genetics terms. We have the genotype, which is the genetic variation. It's a fixed thing, right? So the genes are denoting whether or not you have blue eyes or brown eyes, right? Or what your leaf shape looks like, right? But then you have this phenotypic variation, which is the observed variation of the expression of that gene, which can vary dramatically, and it can in fact be plastic, right? So you can have a lot of variation in the degree to which a given species can be modified by its environment in terms of its morphology, size, etc. And so we see that in this image where we see this as a photosynthetic light curve. And what we see is that this is the same species, and it at lower elevations, it has a much higher photosynthetic rate than it does at higher elevations, where much harsher, drier, more droughty conditions prevail. Likewise, Britain beeches can have a whole bunch of different leaf shapes depending on their environments. And so these are thought to be plastic traits, right? They're not genetically fixed, and they're a bit malleable. And so we can see that with sun and shade leaves for oaks here in the Northeast. And we can also see that in the sunlight, this Palisade mesophyll here, which is where all the chloroplasts are, this is sort of the powerhouse of photosynthesis, is really thick on these sun leaves, and much thinner on leaves grown in the shade. And so that makes a lot of sense, right? They're more photosynthetically efficient because they're harnessing more sunlight energy, right? And so that's an example of a type of trait, a functional trait that might predict how a species does in the post-disturbance environment. So now let's talk about populations. So we've talked a lot about populations already, but this is a population as individuals of a single species within a habitat patch, and they could be different sizes, as you can see here, or different developmental stages. And a metapopulation is just a set of local populations of that single species, right? So that means a population of populations, right? And so what we can see is these are all the same species, but they vary developmentally. So you could sort of think about these being urban forest patches, but they're all the same species. But really what we have, if you use the urban forest example from our forest ethnography projects, is you've got a meta community. And so essentially we've got lots and lots of patches with different species compositions that are different ages since disturbance across the urban forest of Middletown. And they're all connected by seed ring, right? So their offspring can disperse into these other habitat patches and then potentially survive, grow, and reproduce themselves, right? And so that's where this idea of meta communities comes together, is that there are these connections between these patches. I wanted to also sort of talk a little bit about the terminology in the article. My friend Daniel Laughlin sort of defined these ideas in a recent paper. We talk about this fitness landscape as this mathematical representation of an individual population or fitness level, right? So we're using one of these phenotypic traits or functional traits to understand how an individual population might develop over time on this fitness landscape in terms of trait space, right? So it's not a geographical space, it's a trait space. Functional traits then are these morphological or physiological or phenological time, seasonal attributes of a species that impact its fitness, right? So how fast it grows, how fast it reproduces, right? How fast its age at maximum, its age at max height and sexual maturity, where it can reproduce. Also, when we talk about fitness, then as a definition, it's really the growth rate of a population, genotype or phenotype, right? So it's basically talking about like what types of sets of attributes make that population increase, right? Or increase its fitness. So, and so one of the things I wanted to mention is that Daniel Foster's models are pretty complicated. They're mathematical models that basically model over time since disturbance, how these very different sort of components of plant growth might influence a species' fitness or success, right? Growth rate, population growth rate in any particular patch, right? So what we're doing is this is a model that's modeling growth rates based on different traits of trees over time in different patches, right, of the meta community, right? Different parts of the meta community, these communities within communities. And so we know that plant size, things like height, leaf area, how much sapwood is actually moving water in the tree, etc., is influences it's how much photosynthesis it carries out, also how much respiration, right, or turnover, right, that like essentially like how much leaf shedding happens, or how many tissues are lost in the production of net mass, right? So net mass is like a biomass accumulation, right? And so so plant size is a really good predictor of is photosynthetic rate, and then or for carbon sequestration, right? Or how much growth allocation a plant has. And so, you know, that leads to some trade-offs, right? Does this species want to put all of its growth energy resources or photosynthetic photosynthate into growth, or does the species want to put it into reproduction, or maybe it dies because it can't really do either, right? And so that those that sort of decide to put their resources into growth then have to think about things like, you know, how the physical branching pattern and the look of the forest, the physiognomy of the forest relates to like the cost of building those structures, which then of course affects things like growth rate, right? So these are different boxes that were mathematically modeled. If you look at this supplementary materials, you'll see that they're quite complicated. But the idea is that then these were modeled across species and then over time since disturbance. And so I just want to make a couple of clarifications here, sort of thinking about, you know, how can short and tall species coexist, right? And so there's sort of two different ways we can think about that. One is, you know, a single point in time and looking at a light gradient. And so shorter species success can be achieved from traits that promote slow growth, right? And high survival in low light environments, right? So low height growth, high LMA, and just where these species can kind of like hang out in the understory, right? Like a advanced regeneration maple, for example. Taller species will achieve success through the expression of different traits for putting on high growth, right? So they have this trade-off because they're making cheap leaves, but then they can put those resources into growing really high or tall, or putting those resources into getting up into the canopy and then being able to reproduce quickly. And so that's one way. And then the other way is sort of thinking about the temporal component of like how long after disturbance the stand is, right? Or the patch within the meta community, the community within the larger meta community, right? And so early successional species are successful because they have low LMA, short leaf lifespans, and high growth rates, right? So there's a high growth trade-off, similar to what we talked about before. Instead of just talking about a single point in time, now we're talking about time since disturbance. And then late successional species are going to be successful through resource partitioning, right? So shorter late successional species are going to be shade tolerant. They have long-lived leaves. And then tall late successional species with high LMA are shade intolerant, but they're tall, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this idea of leaf mass per unit area. And so it's really, I guess, kind of a measure of like how dense the leaf is, right? It's how much it weighs based on how big the leaf is. And, you know, it's this trade-off, right? You can build leaves that are photosynthetic powerhouses, but that takes a lot of energy. That gives you a high LMA, but then if you lose that leaf, you've spent a lot of energy in creating it, right? And so when we look at the relationship between leaf mass per area and seedling growth rate, relative growth rates, what we see is this inverse relationship. So essentially what these seedlings are doing is they are building cheap leaves to try to be able to put all their resources into high growth. And so what I want to make clear as well is that these models are done on basically looking at traits of seedlings, right? So at small sizes, low LMA strategies have an advantage, right? Because they're able to put all that energy into height growth. But at larger sizes, the opposite is true. So a mature tree, so this gets back to something Kieran was talking about in terms of like, where does the oak fit in? I'm going to get to that in a minute. But so for a seedling, building cheap leaves and being able to put on height growth is really important, right? But those leaves are cheap. And so there's these trade-offs, right? So if you have high leaf mass per area, you have high energy per unit area of leaf, slow leaf turnover, but lots of energy put into one leaf, right? And fewer resources get to be allocated to height growth, right? But it's got these very efficient leaves that, and so as the leaf mass accumulates over time, right? As the tree grows, it actually can put on height growth, right? And be effective, right? Because it's accumulating like solar panels essentially that are highly efficient. On the other hand, something that has cheap leaves, that low LMA, you can allocate more resources to height growth, right? And reach that maximum height for reproduction quickly. And so this is just an example of where you can have sort of a couple of outcomes that ensure success across the meta community, right? And so these two different strategies, and maybe they're in different times since disturbance, right? Different developmental stages, but both of these strategies seem to be successful over the meta community, over these different models, right? And then the other thing is this idea of reproducing at maximum height. And so we see that most trees are just a little bit under 2 meters tall, but there are peaks in other sorts of heights of trees. And so here's an example of a species, right? Blueberry. And, as you can see here, we know that blueberries reach maturity at a really low height. And so what you can see then is that they start to reproduce pretty much immediately after that. So that's what this image is really showing you, is that on the left, you can see a species that's about 2 meters high. As soon as it reaches maximum height, it starts to increase its resource allocation to reproduction, right, over a very short period of time, right? The same thing happens for taller trees. It's just that they have to grow taller in order to reach reproductive age. But as soon as that happens, it's sort of like a switch. And so plants are sort of in this evolutionary arms race for light. And, the ones that are able to harness lots of light energy are going to be able to do and put that light energy into height growth, are going to do well. And so when we think about those trade-offs, maximum height short, well, you're not going to beat the tallest tree in the world. If you have lots of height growth, you will be, but you become reproductive, you reach a reproductive age really quickly, right? And versus delayed reproduction, if you have to grow taller, it takes more time, right? And you have also high reproduction at this short height, whereas the developed forest has more reproduction on tall trees. That's it. Okay, so now I just want to sort of break down like how this figure relates to the models that were done. And so what you can see in this trait mixture at the bottom is that the species are coded by similarly in the other panels. So essentially what we see here is that green trees in this model, basically looking at time since disturbance, they dominate in the beginning and they have high growth rates, right? High heights at maturation, and they have low LMA, right? So basically they're putting in all their resources into generating these cheap leaves and putting on height growth. And then as the probability of disturbance increases over time, because this is time since disturbance, right? All of a sudden you have more species coming in. And so these mid-successional species here that we see in both these areas are somewhere in between for leaf mass per unit area, but we have species that are tall with intermediate LMA, and then we have species that are shorter with intermediate LMA, right? And so when we're talking about this is an example of what this might look like. And then at the meta community level, there would be different patches that are in that successional state. Likewise, over here, we see, however, as time zones disturbance increases, we see a more vertically stratified forest. And then across the meta community, not just across a single patch, what we see is that there are lots of different species that can live in this niche space, right? So we have the highlight species that are growing in these patches that were just recently cleared, right? We have the mid-shade tolerant species that in these areas where we have sort of mid-successional levels, right? Understory reinitiation, possibly, right? And then when we have this developed forest, in fact, we have lots of different species that are differentiating based on their differences in height at maturation. So when we look at these two features together, we start to see how they sort of start to interact with each other. And so what we see here is we see lots of high LMA niches that are filtered by height at maturation, right? So essentially, across the meta community, you get to have all of these species, and late successionally, you get lots of different kinds of species sharing the same space because of these different niches in terms of like how high trees grow. And so, so this is sort of showing you together like the temporal changes and the spatial changes across the meta community as modeled by these different traits and how they influence things like survival, growth, and reproduction. And so again, this coexistence is sort of like a point in time where shorter species have success via these traits that promote slow growth and high survival in these low light environments, right? And then the flip side is that the other species have high growth and low LMA. And then when we think about that and how it plays out across the post-disturbance temporal gradient, we see early successional species having that same low LMA, high age of maturation, right? They get up to the top and they start to reproduce. And then later successional species are common because of this resource partitioning, right? So we see lots of differences. Resource partitioning is important. And that at the meta community scale, you have this like mosaic of different patches of forest in different developmental stages with different species mixes, right? And so where do the oaks fit in? Don't forget that these meta community models were done with modeling seedling traits. And so again, I sort of talked about this before, at small sizes, low LMA strategies have an advantage, right? And so that's because the benefits of cheap leaf construction outweigh the cost of increased leaf turnover, right? At larger sizes, the opposite is true. So when we think about this term plasticity, that's why I put this figure up again, sort of showing the difference between shade and sun leaves in the same species, right? And so what we see is that oaks do put on a lot of high growth when they're young, but once they dominate the canopy, they start to allocate more growth to sun leaves because they reach maximum height. Right. And so I just wanted to sort of answer Kieran's question there. And then where does this all fit in? Well, common gardens are one way we could do that. So you take species and you plant them at all different parts of the environmental gradient, you see what happens. But those are pretty difficult for long-lived species. Density dependent models would be looking at like population numbers over time and how the density of one species or one community, how one species or the entire suite of species, might vary over time looking at growth rates, but you have to have repeated measures or longitudinal data. And then C, we've got these demographic models like we talked about today, population level modeling where you're looking at change over time, but those are also somewhat error prone. And then occurrence is this other way people are looking at how environmental gradients influence species occurrences. And we're going to be looking at that this Friday, in fact, in lab, in our gradient analysis. And so lastly, I just wanted to kind of show you some pictures of work that I've done with the photosynthesis machine, taking these kinds of functional trait measurements, leaf area, leaf mats, root mass, shoot mass. Also worked in Mexico in this current fescue rescue project where we're taking all of these different kinds of little trait and reproductive measurements and environmental characteristics. Because these trait databases, they're really easy to download data, really easy to work with, but producing quality data is not that easy. And in fact, there's still people out there like me that are actually measuring lots and lots of plants. So, and it is hard work. Ask Ezra Steinfeld in the middle there, who was a former Wesleyan student of mine. We do have a lot of fun though. So thanks so much, everybody, and I'll see you in class.